Good afternoon, microeconomists, or good morning, or good night, depending upon when you're watching this. Today we are looking at behavioral economics and risk. We're still in chapter 17, which will be our final chapter for this semester. So, let's talk about risk. So, the way that standard economics models risk is what's called the expected utility theorem. We talked about utility back in an earlier chapter. That was back in chapter 16 again. We said, loosely speaking, utility is the amount of satisfaction or happiness you get from consuming. I say loosely speaking because we're going to take some more advanced classes. You'll see that's not entirely true. I'm going to simplify a little bit for now to keep things manageable for a freshman level class. I realize this is freshman level, not PhD, so some simplifications are necessary, though I want to be honest to what the truth is, as much as possible. Now, our measuring units for utility were utils. I had this example back in our chapter 16 notes. So let's say you have two options available to you. You could go to a concert. I must have written this before the coronavirus. Oh yeah, chapter 16 was back in January, I think, or early February, back when the idea of shutting down the economy seemed like that's never going to happen. So imagine we're back in normal times and people can go to concerts and can go to the movies. Those are real options. And maybe you get 31 utils from going to the concert. So in our notation we'd say utility of concert is 31. Your other option is to go to the movies, and let's say that gives you 17 utils of utility. So we'd say utility of movies is 17. So how do we translate that into some plain English about your preferences? Well, because utility for the concert is higher than utility for the movies, what that means is that you prefer the concert over the movies. So the concert's better. That's all this means. So what we're saying is that you want to do the best you can, give yourself the most possible happiness with your options. So you want to go for the option that gives you the most utility. We also talked about in chapter 16 how to deal with the trade-off between utility for something and the price. So you can go back to your chapter 16 notes to learn about that rule. So you had two choices here. If both tickets were free, you prefer the concert over the movies. If they weren't free, you have a rule from chapter 16 to figure out how to make that decision. So let's say utility is about the satisfaction you get from consumption. Now, if you have risk involved, that means there's more than one possible outcome. So for each outcome, there's some amount of utility you get from that. So maybe you're flipping this coin, and the coin lands heads, you go to the concert. The coin's tails, you go to the movies. So there are two scenarios and two possible amounts of utility you could get depending upon that coin flip. So what you want to consider is how much utility do I get in each possible outcome? Now what our expected utility theorem says is that we take a weighted average of all of those utilities. The weights are going to be the probabilities. That makes sense. It means that you put more emphasis on things that are more likely. And you want to give less consideration to things that are less likely. So here's an example of how the expected utility would work. That's what the utility theorem would work. So let's say Brian has $30 and he and his friend are betting on sports, back when sports were not canceled for the coronavirus shutdown. So he was probably made a bet on the teams, and Brian was betting on a certain team as the favorite, and he's going to win $5 if his team wins. If Brian's team loses, Brian's going to pay his friend $5. Let's say there's a 60% chance that Brian's preferred team wins. That means there's going to be a 40% chance that Brian loses, or Brian's team loses, and therefore Brian's going to lose $5. So let's apply our expected utility theorem. So if Brian starts out with $30 and his team wins, he's going to get $5 from his friend. That means Brian's going to have a total of $35. So Brian thinks about, how much utility do I get? How much satisfaction will I get if I have $35? The other possibility is that Brian's team is going to lose, and Brian's going to lose $5 by paying his friend because he lost the bet. So if Brian starts out with $30 and he loses $5, then he's going to have $25. So Brian's just going to think about, how much utility do I get if I have just $25 instead of 30 or 35. So those are the two possible outcomes and their associated utilities. Now, those two outcomes are not equally likely. So Brian's betting that team's the favorite. So Brian's going to give more weight to the possibility that his team wins because that is more likely. So a 60% chance corresponds to a probability of 0.6. So with probability 0.6, he's going to have $35 and gets that much utility from it. So that's the first possibility. The other possibility is that he'll have just $25 because he's lost 5 of his 30. The probability of that occurring is 40%. So you weight that by 0.4. So this translates into probability of win times utility if he wins. Then you combine that with probability of loss and utility he'll experience if his team loses. So to keep things simple, I was looking at the money side of things. Brian could also get some extra happiness from his team winning because he likes it when his team wins. We're just going to ignore that for now because we're trying to keep things simple. But yeah, you could factor that in and let people care about things other than just money. Economists do not assume that people care solely about money. It's another myth out there. So one thing to be clear about is that expected utility and expected value are not the same thing. Expected value is a weighted average of all the outcomes. Expected utility is a weighted average of all the utilities. So that's different. So to see the difference more clearly, let's go back to that same example with Brian and his friend Bay on sports. We already saw how to find the expected utility. Here's how to find the expected value. So the outcomes here are the money they get, not the utility. So if Brian's team wins, he adds the $5 he won to the $30 he already has, and he'll have a total of $35. If his team loses, he's going to pay his friend $5. If Brian starts out with 30 and he pays 5, he's left with 25. So two outcomes are Brian has $35 or Brian has $25. We then weight those outcomes based on their likelihood. We said that Brian's team wins with probability 0.6. That is a 60% chance. So the weight we assign to that win outcome, that $35, is the probability 0.6. So we start at 0.6 times 35. Now we move on to the other possibility. We said if he loses, he'll have just $25. We weight that by the probability. Probability is 0.4 because there's a 40% chance of a loss. So we take 0.4 times 25. So what does that come out to? 0.6 is 3/5, and 3/5 of 35 is going to be $21. And 0.4, which is 2/5 of 25, is going to be $10. $21 and $10 comes out to $31. That means that the expected value of this gamble is $31. That is distinct from the expected utility, which we saw back here. So again, to be clear, expected utility is the weighted average of the utilities. Expected value, weighted average of the outcomes. Now, this distinction is important, and it can also inform us about Brian's risk preferences. So we can determine, is Brian someone who's going to be risk averse, someone who, all else equal, does not like risk? Is Brian risk neutral? Is he indifferent between risk and safety? Or lastly, is Brian risk loving? Does Brian actively enjoy taking on risks? Your book calls this risk taking. The more common term is risk loving, sometimes referred to as risk seeking in some articles. So here's how you determine which category Brian is in. So let's say Brian has a choice. He can take his save $31 or he can go for this gamble. Now, risk averse Brian likes safety. He doesn't like risk. So if given a choice between the save $31 and a gamble, he likes the save $31. So in general, a risk averse person prefers to get the expected value, in this case 31, with certainty over facing a risky gamble. So someone who might think of it, all else equal, I prefer safety. That's risk averse. If Brian's risk loving, that's the opposite. That means Brian actually seeks out risks, and he'd actually prefer to take a gamble than have this safe, boring outcome where you know what you're going to get. So a risk loving person prefers a gamble to getting the expected value, in this case 31, with certainty. Now, if Brian is risk neutral, then the overall risk is not really a factor into his decisions. He cares about the expected value, and that's going to be the same as the expected utility for him. So he's not going to care one way or the other. Take the gamble or take a safe 31, they're equally good to him. So that's how you can categorize people based on their risk preferences. Now, economics does have something to say about people's risk preferences. And in particular, we predict that people should be risk averse. This comes from something we learned about earlier in chapter 16. We said that people have diminishing marginal utility. We recapped that briefly in the previous episode. So it means that if you, loosely speaking, double your consumption, you're not going to double your happiness. So if you have 2 brownies, you're pretty happy. If you double that and have 4 brownies, you're going to be pretty stuffed and hyperactive because you have so much sugar, so it's not going to double your happiness. So by the same kind of reasoning, doubling your money makes you more comfortable and you like that, but it's not going to make you twice as happy. So if you already have, like, say, $1 million, you're doing very well. If you have 2 million, you're doing even better, but you're going to be happier, but you're not going to be twice as happy. You're going from really, really comfortable to really, really, really comfortable. Progress, but not doubling your happiness. So happiness goes up, but at a slower and slower rate as you accumulate more. So as a result, that's going to cause people to become risk averse. So a poet found a very nice way of expressing it. He said, take a gamble, then you're risking the things that are necessary in order to get things that are superfluous. So if you already have $1 million, then getting a second million is going to help you a little bit, not very much. You might call it extra $1 million superfluous. If, however, you lost the first million and now you're penniless, that would be losing a necessity. So you don't want to lose what's necessary to win things that you don't need. That's going to cause you to become risk averse. So if people are risk averse, then why do we have casinos? Why do we have lotteries? Does that mean economics is wrong? Does that mean people are irrational? Does that mean this is all just nonsense? Well, again, there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about economics, and you can actually reconcile casinos and lotteries with standard economic theory. One important point is, once again, economics does not assume people care just about money. You could care about the game for its own sake. You might think the game is fun. So, on its own, utility of probably losing money would be worse than utility of staying safe. If, however, in the process of probably losing money, you had some fun with your friends playing poker, then if that fun is big enough, it could be rational. So, as long as people enjoy the game and that enjoyment is sufficiently high, then going to the casino can be rational. Playing poker with your friends can be rational. So casinos on their own, or lotteries, do not disprove rationality, do not disprove economic theory, do not disprove diminishing marginal utility. Now, that being said, there are some issues where people really do make violations of economic theory and violations that we cannot reconcile by any means. So there's a large literature out there in experimental economics on the expected utility theorem. So you give people a lot of gambles, they make predictions about how they should behave. They don't always follow those predictions very well. So here's a very common experiment which has been replicated very many times to be a very consistent result. We'll give you two bets, a safe bet and a risky bet. Now, all else equal, we know people tend to be risk averse, so if all things are equal, they're going to gravitate towards a safe bet, so that's not very interesting to test. To make things more difficult to make things more interesting, let's say we'll have the risky bet gives you a higher average return. You might think about stocks and bonds, for example. Bonds are pretty safe, so it's like a safe bet when you buy a bond. You get paid unless the government, unless the company you're buying from goes bankrupt, which doesn't happen very often. Stocks, however, are very volatile, but they also tend to give you a much better return on average. So you could lose the money with a lot of stocks, but you could also gain a lot more money. So on average, if you stay in stocks for a long time, you'll probably do quite well, but there can be periods where you lose a lot of money and you'll find yourself wishing you bought bonds. So the trade-off between, on one hand, I want to get a bigger return, I want to get more money. On the other hand, I also like safety. Now, because of that, reasonable people can differ on whether you want the safe bet or the risky bet. One person who prefers safety could rationally say, I prefer the safe bet. Someone who has a higher tolerance for risk and is more interested in getting a big gain could reasonably say, I prefer the risky bet. So people making different choices is not a violation of the theorem. But here's where the problem does arise. So sometimes a person will say, I'm going to put a higher value on the risky bet than the safe bet. They'll say something like, if I had a choice between getting a safe $30 or this risky bet, I'd say they're equally good. Can't decide. They're both just as fine to me. Then you ask them the same question about the safe bet, and they'll tell you the safe bet is just as good to me, just as desirable to me as getting $25 with certainty. So now you do some reasoning. You say, okay, you put a higher value in the risky bet than the safe bet. That means the risky bet is better than the safe bet. So far, no problems. The problem that arises, though, is that the same person who just told you the risky bet is more valuable then picks the safe bet. If you pick the safe bet over the risky bet, that means safe is better than risky. You can't have risky better than safe and safe better than risky by the same person on the same two bets. That's illogical. Let's call it preference reversal. You cannot reconcile that with the expected utility theorem. So yes, there are some cases where people do violate economic theory with regards to risk. There's also a number of other problems that have been documented with the expected utility theorem. Your book mentions one of them. That is the it's pronounced allay. the Allais paradox. They show a pair of gambles, and sometimes people pick in a way that's inconsistent with the expected utility theorem. So there are some issues where people don't follow this theory perfectly well.